All right, enough announcements. The great George Rable. I didn't put doctor because I didn't think that was fitting enough. So we're calling him the great George Rable. And many of you know George. He's a member of our roundtable. He's an LSU alum and an LSU fan first and foremost, more so than Alabama. So my roll tides go nowhere with George. But and he's got a good team this year. George has more awards than you can count. Lincoln Prize, Jefferson Davis Award. There's like 6 others. Prolific author. I'm not going to go through his entire resume because I put it up on the board. But we're really excited to have George as a member of this group and especially as a speaker. And we're all excited for tonight's topic because it mixes Civil War and religion. Who doesn't want to talk about both of those things? Put your hands together for George Rable.
Well, good evening. I really enjoy this roundtable a great deal, as does my wife, Kay. Glad you're here tonight. I think I heard Miss Maggie in the back, our granddaughter. Hi, Miss Maggie. You need to see the cutest little girl you've ever seen. She's right back there. Let's see. Oh, good. The slide is up. Notice the slide has a question. Was there a religious history of the American Civil War? If the answer to that would be no, you can have an early dinner. But you're not getting an early dinner. The answer is absolutely yes. And that's what we're gonna deal with tonight. In fact, Abraham Lincoln in his second inaugural address pointed out famously, both sides prayed to the same God. Both sides prayed to the same Bible, read the same Bible. And they read that Bible in remarkably similar ways on both sides. There were a lot of biblical literalists involved in talking about the war, and talking about slavery, and talking about other issues. Religious language, religious imagery, religious ideas were absolutely pervasive during the Civil War. And I'm going to start with a question for you, a little quiz question, a numbers question, if you will. In a population in 1855, there was an estimate that the population of the United States was about 27 million. Okay? How many of those people do you think were members of a Protestant church out of 27 million?
20.
I heard 20. Too high.
Yeah.
15.
Too high.
Like 3.
7.
3 is too low. 7 is too high.
5.
5 is a little high, so it's going to be 4. It's going to be 4. Now, you might want to take that number with a little bit of grain of salt. I mean, numbers like that are not all that precise, but it's striking because I think most of us would think much higher than that. Now, the question then becomes why? This followed a period of enormous evangelical growth. The Second Great Awakening began in 1800. The Methodists were growing, the Baptists were growing, Presbyterians as well. Religion was spreading on the American frontier. So why that relatively low number? One of the problems is, of course, the scattered population. There's no doubt about that. Very difficult to bring these scattered, it's still a very rural nation, into churches. The other thing were the demanding standards for church membership. Okay? When my wife Kay and I joined Paradise Valley United Methodist Church, we joined online. And then they asked us to, make donations on a regular basis. That was it. That was it. Didn't have to answer any questions, didn't have to make any profession of faith. None of that. None of that. If you were a member of a Baptist church in the 1850s, there was a good chance you had to give your testimony before the congregation, and then they voted on whether you were worthy or not. And you can't assume that the vote would be in your favor. The other thing is, you had to be willing to have your life scrutinized. Okay? I see some people here, I bet, that I saw at a bar drinking. You might get excluded from fellowship. I think there are sisters in the audience who have been seen dancing. Again, excluded from fellowship. So the standards were high. We would assume today in any church, most of the people in the pews are members of that church. That would not necessarily have been true in the 19th century. There were more people that attend than were members. So that may explain that relatively low number. But we also need to realize there were millions of Americans who were also basically indifferent to religion in one way or the other. Having said that, however, there was in the United States, before and during and after the Civil War, a powerful sense of divine providence. If you're going to remember one word that I say tonight, just remember providence. Providence is going to explain virtually everything I'm talking about in one way or another. The ordinary events of daily life were seen in providential terms. There was a sense, a strong belief that the story of America was part of a larger story of human history, an unfolding of providential design that was absolutely pervasive in the United States. And we mere mortals could at times catch a glimpse of this larger meaning, but human history, both in its long, sweep, and messy details, remained in God's hands. And this kind of God talk was absolutely commonplace. It's in the letters, it's in the diaries, it's in ordinary conversation. Sometimes it's sort of a verbal tick, it may be no more than that, but still, it's around. So it's hardly surprising that many Americans would use their religious beliefs, especially ideas about providence, to interpret and understand both the sectional crisis of the 1850s and the Civil War itself. Today, however, much of that experience is forgotten. How many Civil War books have you read that deal with religion? I would bet relatively few, but there are more and more all the time. When I first started working on this subject, longer ago than I would care to remember, hardly anybody was doing anything. And now there's a lot of younger people, younger historians dealing with this. And I think today, this sort of providential framework is largely forgotten. And let me cite an example. I think everybody in this room, I don't want to comment too much on people's ages, but I think everybody in this room is old enough to remember 9/11. You don't have to be ancient to remember 9/11. In the aftermath of 9/11, I want to mention three ministers. Jerry Falwell, you've heard of him, right? Pat Robertson, you heard of him. Jeremiah Wright. Any Jeremiah Wright people? President Obama attended his church, okay? In the aftermath of 9/11, Falwell, Robertson, and Wright all said that 9/11 occurred because America was being punished for its sins. Now, they differed on which sins were involved. But what struck me was, in all the press coverage of these statements and the sort of public outrage at what these guys were saying, people did not realize that that was a commonplace way to interpret major events. It would not have surprised the Civil War generation in the least. In fact, they'd have been shocked if events in their day had not been explained in providential terms. And so Civil War historians have only slowly started to incorporate religion into their larger narrative of the war. But I would argue that the American Civil War was probably the holiest war in American history. And this first slide illustrates that a little bit. This is Mass for the 69th New York, part of the Irish Brigade. Okay, I don't think, it's not Father Corby, I don't think, I'm not sure. Camp services, lots of camp services with the soldiers. Lots of discussion of chaplains, and we're going to talk about chaplains here in a little while. But the religious framework is everywhere you look. In fact, I keep finding more stuff all the time. And I'm not looking for it, I'm looking for other things, and there it pops up. The war was interpreted, and the sectional crisis of the 1850s was interpreted in providential terms. You have the growing sectional tensions before the war, you have the secession crisis, all interpreted providentially. Why did all this come about? Punishment for individual and collective sins. We'll get into a list of sins here in a minute. So if you're an expert on sin, this is your, whether in theory or practice. Less than a month after the firing on Fort Sumter, a leading Quaker weekly observed that national sins, unless repented of, are always punished by national calamities. It sounds more like Presbyterians, but these are the Quakers. Even Unitarians talked about the nation approaching Pentecostal days. I don't know about you, I don't normally associate Unitarians with that kind of religious rhetoric. So the war then was seen as a divine judgment on the entire nation, North and South alike, and that it served some great purpose, God's purpose. Now, what was God's purpose? And how could we mere mortals discern God's purpose? Well, as I said, punishment for sin. And define sin as widely as you wish. Okay? We're talking about collective sins. We're talking about individual sins. Obvious ones, slavery, political corruption. There was corruption back in this period. Partisanship. There was great disillusionment with political parties. Hard to imagine, right? Others cited greedy materialism. So broad social sins, but also individual sins. Sabbath breaking. Did you go to church last Sunday? Did you take Sunday as a day of rest? What about your tongue? Profanity, blasphemy. Though that great Union General Rosecrans, devout Catholic, made a distinction between profanity and blasphemy. He had no trouble with profanity. He was a pretty profane guy. But he drew the line at blasphemy. Rosecrans, in fact, used to stay up late at night talking to one of his aides, future President James Garfield, who was disciples of Christ, and they'd debate theological questions. Maybe Rosecrans should have been paying a little more attention to other things. But anyway, drunkenness, gambling. Can I say whoring in this context? Sure, I just did. As a verb, okay? And these broad definitions crossed ideological and sectional lines. There was not necessarily what we would see today, a conservative emphasis on individual sin or a reformist emphasis on collective sin. It got all mixed up. A lot of the abolitionists, for example, thought that intemperance was just as important a sin as slavery. If you'd ask Americans at the beginning of the war, what sins is the nation being punished for? Slavery and intemperance would have been right at the top of the list. And so many preachers and lay people, North and South, compiled similar lists of transgressions, but there were some distinctive Confederate themes. The Confederates pointed to the godless U.S. Constitution. What do I mean by the godless U.S. Constitution? Is God mentioned in the U.S. Constitution? I used to say absolutely not, but then some wiseacre in the audience said, doesn't it say in the year of our Lord 1787? Well, that's it. That's it. And the Confederate Constitution, which copied large parts of the U.S. Constitution, did invoke the favor of Almighty God. And during the war, there was a movement in the North to add some acknowledgement of God, or even Jesus, in the federal Constitution. Some of the Presbyterians were eager for this. It didn't really go anywhere. And some Confederates said that Northerners were being punished for what they called political preaching. Preaching about slavery from the pulpit, that sort of thing. And they claimed to disdain political preaching. Well, you can find plenty of political preaching in the South during the secession crisis, even though they might deny they were doing it. Virtually all Southern clergy defended slavery in one way or another, though many acknowledged that slaveholders had fallen short of biblical standards in dealing with their slaves. And of course, the Northern clergy emphasized the sinfulness of rebellion. Immediately, the war is called the rebellion in the North. With suitable biblical citations about the sin of rebellion. At the same time, religious voices, doesn't make any difference, Union or Confederate, seldom expressed much doubt that God was on their side. And although pious young men and their families sometimes ask whether a child of God could be a soldier, most churches and clergy answer that question with an absolutely resounding yes. Even young men in peace churches enlisted. Now, being a Methodist, I figure I should not pick on the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Episcopalians or the Roman Catholics. I better pick on my own crowd. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. Listen to this, the opening prayer of a New York Methodist conference. This prayer comes right to the point. We ask thee to bring these men, the rebels, to destruction and wipe them from the face of the country. Move south. Writing to his brother, a Southern Methodist minister, matched this blood-curdling rhetoric. It is a righteous war, he said. I feel a deep Christian and inextinguishable hatred toward the demons of the North, who would desolate my country and destroy its liberties. It is doing God's service to kill the diabolical wretches on the battlefield. And so sectional loyalties often predominated in the church's reaction to the war. You don't need to say what's the difference between Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians. All you need to know is whether they're Northern or Southern for the most part. Again, Methodist examples. A Southern Methodist deemed the Confederate States of America the last hope of freedom and the last home of the pure gospel. Speaking in almost millennial terms. Northern civil religion was just as fervent. We will take our glorious flag, declared Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson, and we will nail that flag just below the cross. Knowing Bishop Simpson, I would say he might nail that flag above the cross. In fact, Simpson goes around the country giving stump speeches for Abraham Lincoln during the election campaign of 1864. So much for avoiding political preaching. Now you might say, but do all churches embrace this kind of warlike rhetoric? Well, no. There are the peace churches, the Quakers, the Mennonites, and others who tried to maintain their witness against war, but they did so pretty circumspectly. The Quakers sought exemption from the draft, not surprisingly, and they received a sympathetic hearing from the Lincoln administration. Quakers had a little bit rougher time in the Confederacy, no, not a a miserable time. You do wonder what would have happened, however, had it been the Methodists or the Baptists who were the peace church and not the Quakers. You know, the Quakers were a pretty small body, so what they did not really affect the war effort all that much. And Quaker editors were careful. They did not advise tax resistance. You know, one of the ways to stand against the war would be to say, okay, we're not going to pay our taxes. They don't do that. And they also acknowledged that many of their young people would become caught up in the war excitement and it enlisted. There's a wonderful study of Quakers in Indiana that talks about all the young men, all the young Quakers who join up. So then you have the question, what do you do with these guys when they come home? Are they still part of your meeting? Are they still part of your fellowship or not? This becomes a most difficult question. However that might be, we now need to turn to how religion is used to explain the course of the war itself. And here, notions of providence, the idea the war is punishment for sin, apocalyptic warnings about divine judgment, all of these become powerful, and I would emphasize flexible ideas with which to interpret wartime events. The flexibility of religious explanations is absolutely remarkable. And that explains in part why they're so persistent. Now, obviously, religion provides comfort to the anxious and the grieving, both in the camps and at home, a major function of religion. But it also offered an explanation for suffering and anguish, for victory and defeat. Battles and their results became signs of divine intent. And we're going to use one battle as an example. The first major battle of the Civil War. First Bull Run, what the Confederates called First Manassas. And here I'm going to summarize the entire battle in one sentence. So listen carefully. A bungled Federal flank attack and fierce Confederate counterattack just north of Manassas Junction, Virginia, drove the Yankees skedaddling back toward Washington. There's Bull Run in one sentence. A great Union disaster, a great Confederate victory, and the first opportunity to interpret a major engagement in religious terms. For the victorious Confederates, the outcome of the battle, absolutely a sign of divine favor. And this becomes a commonplace explanation throughout the war. But what about all the brave and pious men who fell in battle? At the beginning of the war, there was an assumption that the Lord would safeguard the righteous in battle. If you're righteous enough, you will be protected. You won't be killed. You won't be wounded. Now, it doesn't take long to call that assumption into question. Because at Bull Run, of course, many pious and devout young men were killed or wounded. And so you have the beginning of printed sermons that eulogize soldiers who face death fearlessly and look forward to reunion with their loved ones in heaven. There's all kinds of stuff written about heaven during the war and right after the war. And heaven was pictured as a place where you'd be reunited with your family. And I guess that's a good thing. I guess it depends on the nature of your family to some degree. I can think of a few relatives I might not want to be reunited with for all eternity, but that's very uncharitable. I shouldn't have said that. I couldn't resist the temptation. So heaven was seen at home, as home, and you then eulogize these Christian soldiers who have fallen in battle. A good example. Nice. Whoops, I'm too far along, I think. Let's see. There we go. Stonewall Jackson. One of the great Christian soldiers of the war, right? You can. There's a lot about Jackson and religion. I give a whole talk on Jackson's death and its religious meaning. But anyway, here's an example. A published sermon about Jackson's death. And there were lots of these. So you interpret the fall of a Christian soldier in terms of divine providence. Letters that were sent home by chaplains and other officers, along with countless articles in the religious press, reported the last words of soldiers declaring their faith during their final moments on earth. And keep in mind, one of the things that's so different about death in the Civil War is these guys are not dying at home. In peacetime, these guys would have died at home. They probably would not have died in a hospital. There weren't that many hospitals. They would have died at home. And their family and loved ones would have been there for their final words, their final sentiments, perhaps their final professions of faith. But now they're separated. And so the families cherish anybody that can tell them about the final words of their loved ones. And so these are often recorded. These fine young men are dying, right? Whether from wounds or even more often from disease. But these deaths, despite the mounting death toll, this did not shake people's faith in God's sovereignty. At least not very much. They still saw God as being in control. The Reverend Edward Reed, in the aftermath of First Manassas, told his rural South Carolina congregation, shortly after Confederate victory, he said, "Not one of these brave men has fallen or suffered without God's permission." Every death, every wound took place with God's permission. Now, like the statements Falwell, Robertson, and Wright in the aftermath of 9/11, what might seem as shocking statements were commonplace in this period. Hardly surprising sentiment in an era during which people believed that every death and every illness somehow conformed to God's will. Some people thought if your cow got sick, this reflected the will of God, and maybe you were punished for sin. What about the poor cow? Anyway. Some folks believe, again, citing the Manassas battlefield, that the Lord had chosen the field of combat. The Lord had supplied courage to the soldiers and even controlled the timing of troop movements and tactical maneuvers. Very detailed. By the same token, from the Confederate standpoint, God had confounded the mighty Yankee army just as he had scattered the Assyrians, the Midianites, or the Philistines in Old Testament times. And people would have been familiar with those references because this is a biblically literate people. They could have told you where you could find the Assyrians or the Midianites or the Philistines in the Bible. And in one reference, it shortly resonated with everybody from Sunday school children to graybeards. An Alabama minister explained at some length, and you can fill in the blank for me, how the southern David had slain the northern Goliath. Exactly. And so the first great battle of the Civil War had seemingly vindicated the Confederate cause, and even set some commentators leafing through their Bibles to search for references to the Southern nation in prophecy. In fact, a big old thick book was published with that title, The Southern Nation in Prophecy. If you ever have trouble with insomnia, I strongly recommend that. That will take care of it. It's better than a sleeping pill. It's ingenious, but it's long and tedious too. The smallest incidents become signs of divine favor. Were people praying back home at the time of the battle for a particular company? Was that company then spared from death and wounds? Clearly, divine favor. You have the first accounts of Bibles stopping bullets. The one Confederate once wrote home to twit his mother that there's actually a pack of cards that stopped it. Ooh, sinful, yeah. But you do have these accounts. And the accounts of Bible stopping bullets, we're talking about pocket testaments. These guys aren't carrying full Bibles. We're talking about pocket testaments. They'll tell you the exact place that the point of the projectile stopped, the exact verse in the Bible. And it always carried great theological significance. And now, in the aftermath of this great victory, all the Southern people seemingly had to do was give God the glory and keep their trust. We'll now turn to the Northerners. How do they react to this defeat? They took a different tack, not surprisingly. The judgments of God are upon us, declared a Presbyterian minister. A sentiment that would be uttered on both sides after many of that. The nation's leading Methodist newspaper, the Christian Advocate and Journal in New York, agreed that defeat had been doubtless ordered by Providence as part of a severe but wholesome discipline, which in the end will cure some desperate evils that had existed among us. God had long shaped the nation's history and would continue to do so. And as was typical after almost every major battlefield loss, the defeated side tries to figure out which sins had stirred up God's wrath. When was the first battle of Bull Run fought? What day of the week? Sunday. Yeah, there you have an explanation there. Attacking on the Sabbath. This struck some commentators as highly significant. Stonewall Jackson actually fought a lot of the Sabbath. He claimed not to like it. He certainly did. Others said the failure to observe the Sabbath in camp was also part of this problem. A lot of pious soldiers that came to the Army early on, and even later for that part, would write home and say there's no Sabbath in the Army. We often drill on Sunday or do other things that we don't necessarily pause for religious services or Bible reading or prayer or anything like that. And this surely displeased the Lord. Others blamed the defeat on swearing and alcohol. Can you imagine soldiers drinking alcohol and swearing? Hard to think about. One of my favorite Civil War sermons is by Horace Bushnell, an important minister of the day. Has anybody in this crowd heard of Horace Bushnell? Anybody? No. That's usually the answer. He was noted for a book on Christian nurture that had been published before the war. He's an excellent minister in many ways, congregational minister. And he delivered and then published this sermon, and notice the title at the top, Reverses Needed. Isn't that an odd title? Reverses Needed. And what he means by that is we need defeats. They will be good for us. And this sermon is remarkable for that very point. He worried that the defeat at Bull Run was a warning to the nation that had created a government without moral or religious ideas. He's sort of echoing Confederates on the godless U.S. Constitution. Bushnell termed Jefferson's Declaration of Independence as a bunch of godless theorizing. He said, no wonder the Union must face reverses and losses such as Bull Run, because as he put it, without shedding of blood, there is no such grace prepared. And he will later in the war talk about the importance of blood in the remission of sin, at a point where the bloodletting had become almost unbelievable. Now, Bushnell had no doubt that God was still on the side of the Union, that the North was fighting for just principles with God on its side. But he also believed that more sacrifices would be needed to atone for these national transgressions. The African American clergy also commented on this subject. They warned that the nation had not yet faced up to the sin of slavery. And some debated whether Lincoln's call for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in the aftermath of the Bull Run defeat should even be observed. And the presidents on both sides throughout the war issued calls for either thanksgiving after victories or fasting, humiliation, and prayer after defeats. Henry McNeill Turner, who would later serve as the first black Army chaplain, described the dead at Bull Run as the bloody victims of slavery's hellish caprice. Abolitionists of both races argued that God would allow the bloodshed to continue until slavery was banished from the nation. Throughout the war, denominations, churches, individuals, North and South, agonized and argued over the role of slavery in the war. Religious folks of various stripes had long debated whether God opposed, sustained, or was indifferent to slavery. But the war reshaped this discussion in interesting ways. By the fall of 1862, Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, right? Even the more conservative denominations, including the old school Presbyterians, were coming to see the death of slavery as a military, if not a moral necessity. The northern side would not win so long as the nation clung to what one minister termed the Jonah of slavery. Even pacifist Quakers argued that God was using the war to punish the nation for the sin of slavery. This is water, by the way. My old pal Charlie Rowland, who some of you probably know, used to have a little stick where he drink something flavored with whiskey. No whiskey here tonight. So we have Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The response in the North was interesting. Both races talked about the Exodus story in the Bible. Let my people go. Pharaoh hardening his heart. Some talked of the imminent return of Christ. The millennium would soon be upon us if we got rid of this thing of slavery. The biggest exception to this sort of general, I won't say it's exactly an exception to the providential framework, but it's really an exception to how the churches behaved, are the Roman Catholics. The Catholic Church, of course, unlike the Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, had not divided before the war. The Episcopalians divided at the beginning of the war, sort of, but after the war they come back together pretty quickly. But the Roman Catholics had not divided. Catholics would admit, Northern Catholics would say that slavery was probably a sin, but they thought abolition was a dangerous, radical ideology, and that the principles that had kept the Catholic Church together could have actually prevented the Civil War. A number of Northern Catholic editors argued that the war represented the logical culmination of schismatic Protestant principles. It was the Protestants who were responsible for the war. Why? Because the Protestants are always dividing. They're always dividing. How many different kinds of Baptists are there? You lose count after a while. And so both Northern and Southern Catholics hew to this idea that the church must stay together. And both Northern and Southern Catholics were pretty conservative in that respect. In the Confederacy, the Southern churches remained largely united behind the Confederacy and slavery. Loyal Confederates refused to see the war as a punishment for the sin of slavery. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, defending slavery grew more complicated. Church associations and ministers readily conceded that even though slavery was sanctioned by scriptures, perhaps the behavior of slaveholders had fallen short of biblical standards. Reformers called for two things: the legal recognition of slave marriages and laws prohibiting the breakup of slave families through sale. How far did these reforms get? They didn't get anywhere. They didn't get anywhere. The idea was if you reform the institution of slavery, maybe this will win back God's favor on the battlefield. The politicians were absolutely not interested. None of these reform measures even came to the floor of any state legislature, much less coming close to passage. And so the war goes on, and the casualties mount, and the suffering on the home front mounts too. Does this challenge a providential view of the war's course? To some degree it does. But people also said, look, human beings at best could achieve only an imperfect understanding of God's will. And because biblical history proved that the Lord had often used heathen nations to punish his stiff-necked chosen people, even in 1864, Federals and Confederates alike have not abandoned their civil religion. They continue to believe that God was on their side, however inscrutable divine purposes might be. Of course, when you think of the summer of 1864, even if you just think of the Eastern Theater, what do you have? Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, Petersburg. Horrific bloodletting. And this might readily lead war-weary soldiers and civilians to speak of pointless sacrifices. And they do speak of pointless sacrifices. It seemed logical enough for the clergy to assert that the war had absolutely spun out of human control. But each victory rekindled hope of divine favor, and defeats could still be explained in terms of divine chastisement, the kind of spiritual discipline for those whom God loved. And that brings us to this guy, more obscure than Bushnell even. A Methodist bishop, a Southern Methodist bishop from Georgia, George F. Pierce. As early as the fall of 1862, Pierce sounded a Lincoln-esque note because he could not chase away a deep sense of foreboding about the war. In a sermon, he said, "We are in the Lord's hands, and I know not what he means to do with us. In many respects, the prospects before us are dark. We have wrought wonders on the battlefield that seem to be gaining nothing. The war is without a parallel in the past as to its origins, its battles, its progress, and its results so far. I hope for the best, but I'm looking to God alone. Vain is the help of man." Vain is the help of man. And a lot of people would say that at this point. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering to what extent the soldiers interpreted the war's course in providential terms. Again, widespread reports of indifference to religion in the armies on both sides early in the war. Drinking, gambling, etc. A lot of criticism of chaplains for being ineffective. In fact, both sides, interestingly enough, reduced the salaries of the chaplains during the war. Still, there were a lot of chaplains that served nobly. One soldier said about his chaplain, "We will stick to him every time." Chaplains that helped bring the wounded off the battlefield. Chaplains that helped soldiers write letters home. Chaplains that helped send pay safely home to families. And so you get criticism, but you also get support. And by 1862, you have the first reports of religious revivals, especially among the Confederates, but also spreading to Union forces as well. And these devotional manuals would be distributed. This one by the Reverend Quintard, a well-known Episcopalian. This pocket manual of devotions, be about the size of a pocket testament. Religious tracts of various kinds are distributed by the U.S. Christian Commission, by clergy visiting the camps. So you have a good deal. You have a good deal of that. And you have these camp revivals. Maybe they will win divine favor. Maybe converted soldiers are more effective soldiers. Though as the war drags on, the emphasis increasingly becomes on individual salvation for the soldiers and not so much national salvation. Soldiers themselves could sometimes sound like ministers in discussing the hand of God in battle. But they also emphasize religion as a source of comfort for the grieving. Again, they talked of heavenly reunion with families, regardless of which side. Prayers increasingly focused on spiritual rather than national needs. Both soldiers and civilians could readily believe that peace could only come in God's good time. And of course, people warned, ministers especially, warned both sides against the sin of murmuring against civil authorities, military commanders, and against God. For Confederates, as the war comes to an end, perhaps defeat with God was not so bad after all. For the Federals, as war neared its end, it seemed that the Lord had finally smiled on their cause. The day after the news of Richmond's capture arrived in Washington, the Capitol was brightly illuminated with a gaslighted transparency emblazoned with the message, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." But of course, by 1865, the forces of the modern world and its relentlessly secular tendencies was already putting great strains in the providential worldview. And so this brings us to the final and ultimate meditation on divine purpose. And that is Lincoln's magnificent second inaugural. Throughout his political career, Lincoln had refused to render harsh judgments against Southerners. Of course, he was himself a Southerner born in Kentucky. Even as Confederate armies appeared to be collapsing in the spring of 1865, Lincoln refused to yield to the temptation of triumphalism. And in that magnificent second inaugural, which I think is the greatest speech ever delivered by an American president, if you disagree with that, you are dead wrong. It's better than the Gettysburg Address. If you disagree with that, you'd be equally wrong. What Lincoln manages to do in this remarkable speech, he first of all avoids most of the pious cliches so popular in the North and South. He noted how both sides had not expected the war to last so long or be so bloody. He said each looked for an earlier triumph. He said the prayers of both sides could not be answered, that of neither has been answered fully. He says nothing about the impending Union victory. He says, well, the military situation is satisfactory. There's no bragging, there's no boasting, there's no taking credit. He's meditating on the meaning of the war. And then he says this about the relationship between the divine and the war. He says the Almighty has his own purposes. The Almighty has his own purposes. I don't know about you, I prefer the Almighty to have my purposes. Right? I think that's a sort of natural human tendency. And Lincoln is suggesting we may not understand the Almighty's purposes here. Lincoln is never afraid to leave questions up in the air. And he does so very effectively in the second inaugural, which is probably one of the reasons why it wasn't very popular at the time. He goes on to say, if slavery was such an offense to God that the war had to continue, and that both the North and South had to endure this terrible war, then he could only conclude in the words of Psalm 19, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. A very hard thing to say in the spring of 1865. I don't know what number you prefer to use for deaths in the Civil War. Do you go with the old 620,000, or do you go with the more recent in excess of 700,000? Whichever number you choose, it must have been so difficult for friends and families to say, thy will be done. The Union victory and Confederate defeat left many hard questions about providence and the role of God in human history. And Lincoln did not answer these questions. Read the second inaugural. He does not answer these difficult questions. Doesn't try to. Doesn't assume he's able to. But the whole idea of unanswered questions really does not sit very well. It seems to deal a body blow to providential interpretations of history. And never again would an American war be interpreted in such openly religious terms. Of course, less than 2 months after offering his meditation on the war's meaning, Lincoln himself would fall victim to an assassin's bullet. Was Lincoln's assassination a providential event? Many at the time thought so. They compared Lincoln to Christ sacrificed for the nation. Or more commonly, compared Lincoln to Moses. Why Moses? Moses had not been able to see the promised land. And some even compared Andrew Johnson to Joshua. That's really stretching things. We can explore that at great length, but we won't do so because we are out of time. That's really a subject for another occasion. Thank you very much. I welcome to us. John said I have an overcall or pass the collection plate.
I'm going to try to get this second mic going. It looks like it's working. We got a question right back there. And George left us a good amount of time for questions, so we can get a few of them in.
What did Jewish religious leaders think about God in the war, both on the North and South?
Yes. There are not many direct statements. You don't have any published sermons and that sort of thing. You're talking about a relatively small Jewish population. With Jews, one of the questions is, how do you observe the Sabbath in the army? Very difficult. Lee was very, what's the word I want to say? He was very solicitous of the Jewish soldiers. Now, there's plenty of anti-Semitism on both sides during the Civil War. Denunciations of Jewish speculators driving up prices. Anti-Semitic comments about Judah Benjamin in the cabinet. When Benjamin switched from Secretary of War to Secretary of State, a Richmond newspaper editor sneered, "The representation of the synagogue has not been reduced." And of course, there's Grant's famous order expelling Jews from the city of Memphis. And there are Jewish soldiers. The North at first, chaplains have to be Christians. That requirement is eventually dropped. There are several Jewish hospital chaplains and at least one Jewish regimental chaplain. So I hope that helps. I talk a little bit about Jews in the book, but probably not as much as I should have.
Any other questions? I see 3 hands. All right. And then I got Jim over there.
Just brought it up, why did Grant expel the Jews?
Again, this criticism of Jewish speculators gouging the soldiers, that sort of, he was spurred on by his father, actually, as much as anything else. Grant's father was a piece of work. I think that's the best way to describe. That's the best way to describe Grant's father. And Grant later comes to regret this. Lincoln was kind of appalled. Lincoln hated it when he got dragged into religious questions. There was a big controversy about the removal of a minister in Missouri, and that got all the way to Lincoln, and Lincoln was he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do anything with it. Stanton, Secretary of War Stanton, wants to send missionaries into Southern churches. He wants to send Northern Baptists and Northern Methodists into Southern churches and take over those rebel pulpits. And they do in some instances.
Thank you. I'm surprised, and I apologize if I missed it because I tried to hang on every word. But I'm surprised you didn't mention anything about the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It was written during the heart.
It was.
It was written during the heart of the Civil War, for the Civil War. It became the marching song for the Union soldiers. Everything I've read said it was like went through wildfire through the Union troops. Yep. And they marched to that, and it was full of religious significance, starting with the name, hymn.
Right.
And the South hated it because it attacked attack slavery.
Right.
It directly in its wording. So the point is, it became a very one-sided, but it really became an inspirational song for the Union troops and became despised by the rebels. Any thoughts about that?
Yes. First of all, the original tune is John Brown's Body Lies a Mouldering in the Grave. And Julia Ward Howe was she was inspired by this at some point, and then just dashed off the battle. She wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, I think, one night, and just it was flying across the page. Now there were different versions, of course, later on. Well, Hang Jeff Davis on a Sour Apple Tree. They used that to the same tune. That was popular.
I said it was one-sided.
Yeah. Well, a good friend of ours in Tuscaloosa objected one time when our Methodist church did the Battle Hymn of the Republic on the 4th of July. So this is a song that hates Southerners. How can they do that? One of my students, Christian McWhirter, wrote a wonderful book called Battle Hymns, the best book on music in the Civil War. So if you want to pursue that subject, and he talks about the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And I am a little bit skeptical about exactly how popular it was. I mean, you see references to it, but Battle Cry of Freedom, much more common. There are issues with music. The Hutchinson family singers, who are abolitionist singers, are thrown out of Union camps by my friend General McClellan, I believe. But music was important. It was useful for marching, for morale, for humor. If you've never listened to any of the recordings of Bobby Horton, you ought to do that. I bet you there's people who listen to Bobby. First of all, Bobby Horton's a wonderful human being, but he's done a great thing with music on both sides. And some of it's funny. Some of it's more like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, quite serious. Some of it's very political. But music was important, and sheet music was important. You can go online and look at Union and Confederate sheet music. It's easy to find.
We got a question from Jim.
Was there any estimate of the number of ministers or chaplains in the military on either side?
Yes. Do I know that number? I'm terrible on numbers. I'm trying to think of a guy named Brinsfield, who was I think a chaplain in the Army in our time, did 2 compilations of Union and Confederate chaplains. Fox's regimental losses during the Civil War will list the chaplains who were killed in battle, about a dozen or so. There's lots of letters from chaplains, some very good ones, including cross-denominational. There's one by a New York chaplain who I think he's involved. He meets this priest. And he's either a Congregationalist or an Episcopalian, very different religiously than Catholic priests. And one night it's cold and they're sleeping near each other, and one of them says, "What do you think God would think of this? Right-ribbed Congregationalist, Presbyterianist, Catholic priest." And the other guy says, "I think God would like it." I think God would like it. The chaplains also face a question with baptism. How do you baptize people? Do you immerse or do you sprinkle? And this becomes an important question. And the chaplains finally kind of work with each other. In a lot of cases, they let the soldier choose whether he wanted to be immersed or sprinkled. Solve that question.
I think we got another question. We got Brad.
One up front.
And one up front. All right. We got time for 2 more, I think.
Hey, great presentation, by the way. I've always known somewhat about Lincoln's religious feelings, but what about Jefferson Davis? I really don't know anything about that.
There's a good reason you don't know much about it. There's not much information there. Davis joins the Episcopal Church in Richmond during the war. And any statements of Davis on religion, I could probably, if I could remember them, I could probably give them to you in about a minute. There's not much. There's not much at all. But there's, you know, they're interested in the fact that Davis belongs to the church, he's baptized, and this is considered good. And people paid attention to the religion of their leaders, though often they had no idea. At the beginning of the war, I think people described Lincoln as a Quaker. He never joined any church. They had the whole cabinet basically gone. But they paid attention. Christian soldiers, Lee, Jackson, Rosecrans, Oliver Otis Howard. When McClellan issues an order about Sabbath observance in the Union Army, the religious press loves this. So McClellan is then sanctified as far as they're concerned. But I'm afraid not, you could look at Jack Davis's biography of Davis or Bill Cooper's biography of Davis, both excellent books. You will not find much on religion there. And it's because it doesn't exist.
All right, we got another question back here from Brad.
Also, I was also surprised that you didn't mention Battle Hymn of the Republic, because at the end of the song, the last verse part of the chorus makes your point about the division of religion based on whether you're north or south. It ends with "Our God is marching on," which might be a problem if you're in the south.
But there is a sense that's perfectly right, because God is marching with the armies as far as people on both sides are concerned.
But I'm wondering, how did the war affect religious faith and religious, I don't want to say popularity, but how did it affect the churches and the synagogues after the war, when clearly on the northern side, God has inflicted a bunch of injuries? And in the South, we've been hearing the soldiers have been hearing for years that God was on their side. And they were fighting for God, and God was behind them. And they lost.
Okay, 2 points. Remember what I said about flexibility. If you lose, God is punishing you. And he's punishing you with the heathen Yankees. But had God not done that repeatedly in the Old Testament, heathen nations punishing the children of Israel. So there's that. Now, there's some disagreement among historians. I have a definite opinion on this. I don't think there's that much religious disillusionment after the war. There's some historians who disagree with that. If you read the end of Drew Faust's fine book on death in the Civil War, she ends with all these religious skeptics. But I think they're a minority voice. I think a lot of this framework survives in part because it's so flexible. Now, obviously, the churches are affected. The southern churches are devastated by the war. You have physical destruction. You have the loss of members. You have northern missionaries coming down to the south after the war. You have African-American missionaries. The African Methodist Episcopal Church does very well in the South after the war. Because before and during the war, blacks, slave and free, had been members of white congregations. Now they had to sit in the gallery. They couldn't sit down on the main floor of the church. And they were segregated. But they were members of churches. Once slavery is disintegrating and the war is over, the formerly enslaved leave these white churches. And so the AMEs do very well after the war. There's a pretty good book on that subject as well.
All right, do we have any other questions? Otherwise, we're gonna,
You got one down.
okay,
Dick's
we got
got
Dick's down.
Dick's got a stumper for me.
I was gonna try to stump the crowd. So Chaplain Scott that our fine city is named after, was in which regiment in the Civil War? Does anybody know the answer to that? Isn't that crazy? Which side was he on? Yeah, we at least know that part. You guys passed the test. I was hoping Dick would know the answer because.
No, that even stumps me, but I think it was from New York.
Yeah, it was.
Aside from the Quakers, I assume there were other conscientious objectors of religious grounds.
Mennonites, for sure.
And how were they handled by the governments of the North and the South?
The Confederates are a little bit harder on. The northern side's a little bit easier on. As I said, it's a good thing they were small groups, or it would have been much harsher, I think. And what you have with both Quakers and Mennonites, you have young men going off to fight. They're caught up in the war excitement too, and so the churches have to decide, particularly the Quakers have to figure out, are we gonna let these guys back into fellowship, into our meetings when the war's over?
Weren't there members of other denominations that read the Bible in a way?
Oh, yes, certainly. And, there were young, very devout men said, look, I don't know if I can kill. And of course, as we know, in combat, this is true, and there's been a study done in World War II of the number of men that did not fire their weapons. And I think there were a lot of guys in the Civil War that maybe didn't fire their weapons. I don't know that, but I have a suspicion of that. And of course, you could always opt for hospital duty. You could become a chaplain. Some chaplains did pick up a gun when necessary. But there's really not a whole lot of information on individual soldiers saying, I can't do this. Now, obviously, some that desert maybe were in that category, but we just don't have much direct. It's a great question. It's one I've never been asked, which I like, but I don't have a good answer.
All right, well, that's going to conclude this evening's program. We get to George Rable.
Yeah, I saw that. I'm not the king.
Be in touch with you. Yeah,
Roll Tide.
Good to see you again.